And many of us have been here several days, and we're all a little tired. But, oh, fantastic, thank you. So let me just very quickly introduce our esteemed guests. We have Ryan Sim, who is the MPA Singapore Center Director and First Secretary. At the very end, we have Thomas Cockblanc, who is the Managing Director of the Rocky Mountain Institute. We have Catherine Palmer in green, in the Fortescue Green. Catherine is the Maritime lead for the high-level champions team. And we have Sam Lowe, he has probably the most exciting title, representing the Australian government and head of renewables superpower. So very exciting. So as you can see, we're looking at the Fortescue Green Pioneer and also just the elements of a just and equitable transition in zero-emission shipping. And the discussion today is going to talk on a few topics. We're going to first celebrate the success of the Fortescue Green Pioneer, and if you're not familiar with that, I'll be giving you a little bit of an overview. But we're also going to be talking about elements of the just transition. I think a lot of times, especially right now at COP29, when we think of the just transition, we really think of finance and obviously the global south. But there's also another really important element, which is effectively looking at the people side. The people side when you're transitioning, for example, to alternative fuels. And so we've got Catherine here who's going to talk us through a little bit around what's happening with the crew safety and effectively how that is getting reshaped and rethought. And then we're going to also be talking about a little bit of a perspective from the Australian and Singapore side in terms of how they're embracing these new opportunities with zero-emission shipping. So, and finally, with Thomas, we're going to get a bit of a perspective on what's on the horizon. So how are we looking at the green shipping corridors, for example, and what are the key takeaways and how we can start building that into our global economic growth story. So just to maybe start real quickly on the Fortescue Green Pioneer. Yes, this is a picture of it right here behind me, looking very glorious in the harbor at night. The Fortescue Green Pioneer was, for Fortescue, a mission to show the world that zero-emission shipping was possible this side of 2030. And so like many things we've done with other zero-emission shipping or zero-emission technologies, we effectively decided that we were going to convert a service vessel, a 75-meter service vessel, to run on ammonia. And this journey started about three and a half years ago on a test bench in Perth, and is now effectively, that marine engine's been transported and installed in this service vessel, which has now been operating for the last roughly year. It was around March of 2024. But we found that while Fortescue was ready to start moving into this zero emissions world, the enabling environment that we needed was not there. With the exception maybe of the MPA, one of the very few, very forward-thinking ports. And so what we did was started working very closely with the MPA on looking through all of the safety and environmental aspects that would be required, including preparing all of the emergency response, safety protocols, looking at PPE, the whole slew of the safety manuals that you would need to be able to operate this ship. And over the course of the last year, we have produced with the MPA, and the MPA leading in this, over 300 documents on these topics. And we've presented this to the Marine Safety Committee at the IMO twice, and probably one of the most exciting results or outcomes that has come from this exercise is that the interim guidelines for ammonia as a marine fuel are set to be approved in December, so next month. And so this is something that could have potentially been years away. But by accelerating and working very closely with the MPA, effectively getting this documentation prepared, as well as also just the training exercises, we were in a position to be able to accelerate that timeline. But I just want to start maybe with Catherine. If we can take a few steps back and look at this maybe from more of a 32,000-foot perspective. Can you talk us through the elements of the just transition and why this safety aspect is so important?
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be on this panel this morning and to really talk about the people side of shipping's transition to zero emission fuels. We've focused so much on the technology transition and the economic transition, and I think, but at the heart of this, that we really need to focus on people. And back at COP26, in fact, we launched the Just Transition Maritime Task Force, and this was the first sectoral task force dedicated to putting seafarers and the workforce right at the heart of the maritime energy transition. And so, as you said, we look at a just transition based on ILO's principles around being fair and inclusive. And that kind of happens at different levels, whether that's at the country level, whether that's at the community level, or whether that is down at the individual level. And I think what the demonstration here of the Green Pioneer is right at that individual level to ensure that the workforce is part of this transition. And so for businesses that are putting together their transition plans on how they would decarbonize their fleets, that social dialogue with their workforce is right at the heart of that. And what I would say is that, the Just Transition Task Force first of all looked at understanding what is the size and scale of the challenge. And evidence shows that by the mid-2030s, we need to keep shipping on the trajectory that has been set by the IMO. We need to upskill and retrain at least 800,000 seafarers. And the industry as a whole supports around 2 million seafarers. So this isn't just about proving the technology feasibility of near zero and zero emission fuels, but this is about making sure that those seafarers that are operating zero emission vessels have the skills, the knowledge, and the training in order to be able to do this safely. And so just last month at Crew Connect in Manila, the Just Transition Task Force launched a baseline framework for the training competencies that are needed for operating ships on hydrogen, ammonia, and methanol. And that ranges from everything around understanding the properties of these fuels from a safety aspect, and it's around specialized knowledge in these fuels, and also then the systems that will have to be used on board in order to ensure that the workspace is safe for those operating in these environments. Particularly when we're using some of these fuels in enclosed spaces, it's very different, and detection systems will be different, and PPE requirements would be different, and so we need to make sure that all this is addressed. And then obviously the task force are very much working with the policymakers and making sure that these requirements and the competency framework, the training standards, are all fed into the International Maritime Organization. So updates and revisions to the standards, training, and certification and watchkeeping convention can also be updated in parallel to setting the environmental regulations, which are also done by the IMO. So,
which, quite frankly, have been a major concern. I think all of us are familiar with the fact that, ammonia in our ports has been something that's been a bit of a concern, right? And so it's been excellent to see the incredible progress that's been made on this front.
Definitely. There's significant progress has been made. Like I said, just since COP26, when we look at the progress and how the workforce, and how we have also, we have seafarers engaged in the COP process. Seafarers come, seafarers talk on panels, so they are part of this conversation. And I think that's something that is really positive to see, that we are engaging the workforce in this dialogue. So that's kind of the size and scale of the challenge. That's why it is so important, and that's why we need to do it in parallel. It's not an afterthought. It's not something that comes after we've set the environmental regulation. It's something that has to be done in parallel.
Thank you, Catherine. Well, as I said at the beginning, the Fortescue Green Pioneer would have not been possible, and this incredible progress would have not been possible without the MPA. They're truly one of the most progressive and forward-thinking ports in the world. And so, Ryan, I wanted to ask you, what is the MPA doing in terms of shaping the standards as well as just the regulatory framework around ammonia as a marine fuel?
Yeah, thanks so much, Sarah. I mean, you've been very kind in talking about MPA and what we've been doing. I think we have been in a good position to contribute in this whole transition, especially with the Green Pioneer project. I think that was a huge opportunity for us to understand and really gain that experience when it comes to handling of alternative fuels. Green Pioneer is not our only kind of alternative fuel experience. We also had a few with methanol last year and earlier this year as well. And all of that collectively combined, I think, were really valuable for us to build some of those standards, some of those training requirements in our domestic setting. But what we've also found to be valuable and useful is that we are also able to bring that to the IMO. So I think you mentioned earlier with the interim guidelines for ammonia, that's going to be adopted in MSC in 3 weeks' time. But actually the work has been ongoing at CCC, at the carriage of cargoes and containers subcommittee for a while now. And I think with some of this experience that we've gained, we've been able to contribute, we've been able to participate, we've been able to share and shape some of those standards and some of those guidelines and functional requirements that we've derived from our learnings. So that's been helpful. That's for the interim guidelines for ammonia as fuel. I think IGC is looking at interim guidelines for ammonia cargo, using ammonia cargo as a fuel. That's the next kind of bound for ammonia, and we look forward to continue participating in those forums and making sure that what we've learned, what we've gained, it's not something we want to keep. I think something we want to continue to share and continue to help shape what's happening globally. And I think Catherine earlier mentioned about the Just Transition Task Force. I think I absolutely agree with so much of what you said. Seafarers and who they are, they really represent. I think yesterday the IMO SecGen in another events mentioned how maritime is like the aorta of a trade. And I was just thinking, I guess in using the same analogy, seafarers would be like the red blood cells, right? That they're running through the aorta, the arteries, the veins, and without them you can't live, right? If they're not there and if they're not able to.
Such a good example. And I think, honestly, shipping in general, it's just kind of invisible, even though every one of our lives is impacted.
Yeah.
And almost everything in this room, everything in the built environments we spend 90% of our time has been, transported through shipping. And the seafarers that have been operating that ship, and yet they're unseen. They kind of go a little bit forgotten, but you're absolutely right. They're critical and vital, not only to our everyday lives, but also to our future prosperity.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And if we don't take care of them, if we are not kind of full on with safety and making sure that safe, this transition is not going to happen. It's not going to happen without them. So I think that's where we are really focused. That's partly why we have also set up the Maritime Energy Training Facility in Singapore, METF. We see that as really complementary to what the Maritime Just Transition Task Force is doing. And we, there are so many seafarers to train, and we hope to do our little bit to help push that forward.
That's amazing. Thank you, Ryan. Well, certainly without the seafarers, we won't have green shipping, but also without the green fuels, we won't have green shipping. In Singapore, obviously, it's relatively land limited, so I think it will be very much looking to its southern neighbor. So Sam, can you talk to us a little bit just how, from the Australian government perspective, how are they looking at this green shipping opportunity? We're looking at volumes in the order of 240 million tons of green ammonia. Shipping would be by far and large, forgive me, one of the biggest markets for the green fuels. So how is Australia looking at this?
Great question, and thank you. So I think we've got the 40,000 view before. I'll probably try and give a 100,000 foot view and then sort of come down a bit. So my job in the Australian government is sort of the Renewable Superpower Strategy branch, which I didn't name, but is wonderfully exciting. A big part of my job and the way I think about it is all about sort of context and perspectives. And some of the work that we've done very closely with our Treasury Department has been to try and sort of at a deeper level really understand what does Australia's role in the global economy look like as we transition, but also as our partners transition. And a big part of that is understanding our context and understanding, where our strengths are and where the strengths of our partners are. Certainly, from the work that we've done, and you look at sort of, what are the top comparative strengths that we think about it that Australia has. We're incredibly lucky with the land mass we have. We're incredibly lucky with the renewable resources, mineral resources. Also incredibly lucky to have some really, really strong, institutions to do with, innovation and research. So we sort of pulled that all together, and I guess that was sort of the genesis of the sort of Future Made in Australia agenda, which sort of, has a really strong focus on onshoring and value adding, but some of the broader purpose is also thinking about how do we position ourselves to best support, our partners. And Singapore is a classic example where, incredibly different national circumstances, but incredibly complementary national circumstances. And we've got a very strong, relationship with Singapore, and including in Maritime and a number of things there. So that's sort of the macro perspective. A big part of that package was thinking about new alternative fuels. So hydrogen, obviously a very big focus. There's a sort of around $8 billion in support for renewable hydrogen in the most recent federal budget. Also some ongoing work thinking about low carbon liquid fuels. I think for Australia, there's also the sort of hydrogen story, but also the biofuel story and sort of how we bring them together. And then we start thinking about, advanced e-fuels down the line and sort of bringing those two streams together. So I think there's certainly a lot of work on the fuels front. For Australia as well, and again, sort of perspective and context, maritime's really, really important for Australia, but it's really important in very different ways to energy and industry. Maritime only makes up sort of about 0.4% of our emissions. So from an emissions point of view, it's not unimportant, but it's certainly not on the same order of magnitude as, say, energy. But it's incredibly important for our role in the world. Around, I think, 99% of our exports by weight or by volume. I always get the number wrong. I think by weight, actually. 99% by weight go by sea, and around sort of 86, 87% by value go by sea. So it's something we need to get right. As you sort of alluded to, I guess, and this is sort of part of our relationship with Singapore, wanting to work really closely on thinking about how we can step up and support the fuel for shipping, and sort of some of the measures I mentioned before. But I think maritime industry is hard, and some of the sort of the work ongoing sort of shows that there's still some really, really fundamental building blocks we need to put in place to enable this to occur. Obviously, on the innovation side, a really big focus in getting the engines right, but also ensuring we have safe handling. And social license, I've heard a number of discussions, is sort of paramount to all of this, and we need to get that right from the get-go. But also sort of on the emissions side and sort of building that trust. So for us, big emphasis on our guarantee of origin scheme, which is about certifying hydrogen, but also eventually low carbon liquid fuels and other things. Again, getting that right from the start. Because I think maritime's going to be hard. It's going to be a long journey, but we sort of need to get those building blocks in place.
Absolutely. And hopefully, if we're exporting a lot of green fuels, you'd want to make sure that those are being transported on green ships, right, as well. So we've got a full circle. So Thomas, I know that not you necessarily personally, but I know that Rocky Mountain Institute has just come out with a fantastic report, that you co-published with the Global Maritime Forum in looking at green corridors, and there was a real specific focus on the green corridors between Australia and Asia. Can you talk to us a little bit about some of those key findings?
Thank you, Sarah. And indeed, we co-published a report called Oceans of Opportunity, where we looked at the roles of ports in the shipping energy transition. And I think there are a couple of, maybe two major things to keep in mind. Is better? Okay, not really. It's not. This one? Oh, so we're ruining it. No, it's better. Thank you.
We were trying to be helpful.
I know. So, two major things for shipping. One is that in the next decades, as we transition the global energy system, you got to keep in mind that roughly 40% of everything that is shipped on the ocean is fossil fuels. So oil, coal, and natural gas constitute 40% of everything we ship. Now, of course, there will be other forms of energy transported as well, and a lot of those ships can be repurposed. But the to and from might change over time. And also, obviously, trade patterns can change over time. It's a lot harder to predict exactly how that will change. Fundamentally, trade, international trade is a pretty robust trend over the whole arc of industrialization and will very likely continue. But again, the specifics of to and from might change. So we try to take, and the shipping industry per se is quite agnostic to the to and from, but the ports are not. So we try to take that as a starting point of saying, what can we say about how different ports and hubs will be impacted, both from the underlying trade flows, but also from the changes in fuel production supply chains. Now, as has been pointed out, current ports at least are generally constrained in their ability to produce green fuels for two main reasons. One is infrastructure, so the amount of power you need, basically, to produce both ammonia or methanol, which are the two main fuels we're generally talking about, is orders of magnitude larger than the typical interconnection you have to a port, right? And the second is real estate. So there is not enough land available to put the renewables on. So maybe you can build another Jurong Island, but it's likely not going to be enough anyway. So and the third thing to keep in mind is that the gap, similar to oil and gas, the gap between production cost between different locations is wider than the cost of moving the fuel. So we will see, going back to the original point of shifting trade patterns, we will see new trade, very likely, of clean fuels from to the hubs that are serving ships with the low carbon fuels, right? So what we also tried to do is to get away from academic discussions of long-term availability and future outlooks, and say if the IMO aspirations actually come through, we're going to need a lot of fuel very soon. And if you stack up all the methanol projects, you get to significantly less than 1% of global maritime fuels, right? So if we want 5% by 2030, we need something else, and ammonia by scale actually has the capacity to provide that fuel. So, we're seeing methanol is in high demand because it's available sooner and there are rules in place to manage it and operate it. But even in the midterm, the supply is constrained, and ammonia will play a very important role, right? So when these bunkering patterns change, I think it's going to be important for ports to take and sort of capture a first mover advantage of being able to provide the fuel that enables the shipping industry to deliver on the IMO ambition. And so it's both on sort of on-ship management of the fuel, but definitely as well how to manage fuel in the port. So the work that you've done, I think in Singapore in particular, to cut through red tape and understand practically how the fuel can be supplied, and also participating in these green corridors is really important, because in many cases the fuel also needs to be supplied at the other endpoint of a shipping route, right? So I think it's inspiring to see. The last 18 months have been a very exciting development for shipping in general, and I'm just happy to be here with the first movers.
Thank you, Thomas. Well, talking about changing trade patterns, I've got another question for Ryan. On the basis that, so the mining companies like Fortescue don't currently bunker out of Singapore. We would bunker out of Port Hedland. And so the question I have for you is, what is the MPA doing in terms of maybe influencing or impacting those current bunkering patterns? What is the MPA doing in order to kind of attract, let's say, some of the bunkering business, for example, from some of the mining companies coming out of the Pilbara?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think as a bunkering hub, as we are now, I think we remain really committed to ensuring that we support the maritime industry in this transition. So as the maritime industry and as ships start to move towards alternative fuels, we want to be able to support that. I don't want to say that we are intentionally trying to, change trade patterns per se. But because Australia and because of so many Australian companies like Fortescue are so kind of forward-looking in some of these new fuels, we want to be ready to support with these new fuels, methanol, ammonia, eventually possibly hydrogen as well. So for ammonia, for instance, we have done the expression of interest, which has led to the RFP in Singapore for the supply of ammonia. And how we have done it in Singapore, I'm not sure if everyone's aware. We have sought to aggregate the demand in Singapore for both power generation and bunkering. So for us, as a renewable, poor country, we will need to rely on fuel and need to rely on some of these alternative fuels if we want to meet our net zero targets domestically for our country. And so power generation is a key sector that requires some of these new fuels. And what we've done is that we've coupled that with the bunkering needs and the bunkering requirements. And that's where we have seen some of these projects coming in. We have shortlisted 2 consortiums earlier this year. And part of these consortiums include building up the bunkering infrastructure and supply chain in Singapore. I think, if I'm not wrong, there's also 3 additional proposals that we have accepted or shortlisted, one of which is Fortescue and Equatorial.
Yes, that's an exciting piece of news as Fortescue continues to take
yes.
bold steps into the land of uncomfortable and new. We have a preliminary bunkering license. That's right. I think we're the only energy player that's got the preliminary
So with that, I think we're moving ahead. We are looking at these kind of 5 proposals. We are looking at which ones will be able to partner with us to take the next steps. But that's how we're building it. We want to we keep talking about first mover advantage, and I think we see that as sharing this advantage with the industry, right? It's not for us, it's so that we can support. If you have a ammonia capable vessel, and there is no port that can support the bunkering of ammonia, then we are kind of stuck. So even as we see companies taking bold steps, I think as a country, as a port, as a key bunkering hub in the world, we want to be able to support. And that's why we are building some of these things really quickly. We are looking at a lot of our infrastructure. Yes, we don't have a second Jurong Island to reclaim, but we are looking at our infrastructure. We are looking at storage facilities, working with our partners in Singapore to see how we can scale those facilities as well. So I think all in all, looking at the supply chain, we are building that here in Singapore. And notwithstanding that, we are also working with Australia. As was mentioned earlier, we have formally established the Green Corridor with Australia earlier this year. And that will really be the kickstart of looking at projects, looking at how we can develop and grow the ecosystem, not just looking at bunkering operations in Singapore, but really the entire supply chain as well.
No, that's fantastic. And as a ship owner, as well as a green fuel provider, having that visibility, having a port like Singapore, ask for these expressions of interest or these RFPs, it gives us this great comfort because we're able to see year after year, month after month, this continued trajectory, right? And so it creates a lot of investment certainty for us, for sure. So taking us just maybe a step back, I want to go back to you, Catherine, because as we kind of incorporate again that just transition aspect, you were telling me the other day that there was actually a report recently, also, or maybe last year, that was released that looked at green corridors. Maybe it wasn't so specific, Australia, Singapore, Australia, Asia, but looked at the just transition, or basically seafarer well-being, as a key component to these green corridors. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, that's right. And I just want to pick up on a little bit of the conversation. We started on the people and the seafarers on board the ships, and then we moved into ports and the energy transition. And I'd just like to point out, there's over 17,000 ports around the world that support a significant workforce. So the just transition is not just, about the seafarers on board the ships, but it's about how do we, as the ports transition and the operations within the ports change, to be able to supply near zero and zero emission fuels. Then obviously we have a whole workforce from the port side that we need to consider. So I think we just don't want to think about the just ports and how trade will change. It's not just about imports and exports. It's about the people side and the livelihoods that these ports provide to workforces and the local communities. And as you said, Sarah, one of the things that was published at COP28 last year was how we could include the just transition into green corridors. So green corridors has been, again, originated out of COP26 with the Clydebank Declaration. And that really stimulated and built momentum for the sector to get behind what we now probably call first mover projects and initiatives. And we have a proliferation of about 42 green corridor consortiums around the world. And one of the things that we were sort of looking at, and it was the Mercer McKinney Muller Center for Zero Carbon Shipping and the Sustainable Shipping Initiative, that kind of said, well, under this concept of green corridors, so they're looking at the techno-economic feasibility and what is needed from a policy enabling environment to create these corridors. What about the people? If these are platforms for demonstration and platforms to test and pilot things, surely these green corridors should also be looking at what is also needed from a just transition and a workforce perspective. So that came out with some recommendations. So when you're doing your feasibility study of a corridor, let's not just look at where the supply for the fuels come from. Let's also look at what is needed for retraining, upskilling both the workforce on board the ships, but the workforce in the ports. And I think it's already been mentioned about the community aspects of those that have to live near these ports and hubs that are going to be storing large volumes of products like ammonia, and what the public perception of that is. So it's very much about how do you include these more social aspects into your green corridor feasibility study. And I must admit, I don't think to date I've seen one. I think when I look at the feasibility studies that are being published around green corridors and the concepts, that is still lacking in that space.
And it's a bit challenging because to a degree we're kind of building the plane as we're flying it, as they say. And so this does become, but so long as it's kind of purposefully integrated into these learnings, year after year. Ryan, yes, please.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that. I think I agree with you that even in many of the corridors that Singapore has with many of our partners, we haven't perhaps we need to start the conversation soon, because a lot of it, what we have gained from our experience with methanol last year, methanol this year as well, and with ammonia earlier this year, was that there are a lot of concerns. For a port like Singapore, where it's dense, it's also close to our communities, residential areas. These are fundamental concerns for us from a national perspective. And that's why even in these pilots that we have done, and these operations, we went to great lengths to, we worked with our research institutions in Singapore to look at modeling of, potential plume clouds when it comes to, especially with ammonia, not just on the ship, but if the ship is at port, let's say if it's at PSA, at the container terminal, what's the impact going to be like? What kind of response time do we have? A lot of this is still very, very early stages, still very preliminary, but these are things that we have to think about. Otherwise, it's not going to fly, and it's going to be really challenging. So I think I agree with Catherine. I think we need to take this conversation to the corridors as well, and working with our partner on the other side to see how we can share experiences and kind of build that together.
No, fantastic. And certainly it's worth noting that this is really the gold standard right here, this thinking, the way, it's true. There's very few ports around the world that are as probably progressive. And it's important because there's quite a few very reputable publications, the International Energy Agency, IRENA, the Race to Zero Coalition. It's all very clear that, green ammonia will be effectively the fuel for shipping, by 2040. And there's really kind of no way out of it. So we really do need to start, I think, accelerating and pushing a little bit harder to make sure that, the other ports around the world, and make sure that we're in a position to where we can meet that 5% target, not just because we've got, the incredible green fuel supply, but also because we've got the enabling environment as well as the safety element that runs deep through. I wonder are there any questions from the audience? I think we might have just a few minutes. Putting you on the spot here as you weren't expecting it. I'd love to, yes.
I feel bad stealing your mic. Are there any other fuel options is it methanol and ammonia? Are we confident? Because when you're thinking about workforce development, which fuels? What does the future look like? And when I know there's a range of different options, how do you then prepare for the future if you're not exactly sure what that is?
Or maybe there will be a few options. There's going to be more than one. Thomas, I'd love it if you took that.
Yeah. So there are options, but this is where, again, I think it's important to get away from the academic discussion of potential options and look at the reality of supply, but also for competition for feedstock. So the other options are biofuels, which is in strong competition with aviation. And even methanol is in strong competition with aviation and other sectors because you need a feedstock of carbon to sort of to make the biomethanol. So both of those fuels are in strong competition. Ammonia, of course, there is the other big use of ammonia is in fertilizer. So there is a linkage to ultimately to agricultural sector. I would argue, and looking at this wall painting called resilience here, I mean, a lot of, when we did our analysis, a lot of the supply potential is in other places than we currently source fossil fuels from, right? So it's in markets that might be underinvested or where you have a great economic development opportunity, and there's a great synergy between shipping fuel production and fertilizer production to increase food security in the global south, which is currently exposed to very high LNG import prices to sort of even, provide that product to their domestic market. So, I mean, there's lots speaking practically in favor of ammonia. If nothing else, just the fact that it's scalable and it's less competitive for other sectors' use.
Yes, thank you. We've discussed the safety factor when it comes to work and workforce on board. I was wondering how the panel was thinking about the potential impact and the safety hazards for aquatic life in port of ammonia spillage.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think I briefly mentioned earlier of how we've worked with many of our research institutions on modeling the ammonia kind of plume cloud in the air. But what we also did, also with the methanol projects earlier this year, was to look at the modeling in the water. So when it comes to spillage into the sea, we look at some of the concentration. It really does help when it comes to being able to use some of these tools to inform where exactly would be best for some of these initial pilot operations. So eventually when we did the Fortescue Green Pioneer trial, we had to choose a location in our anchorage in Singapore that is not just safe for humans, but would also be a place where impact to biodiversity and marine life would be limited and minimized as much as possible. So I think as much as possible we want to employ and use as many of these tools as possible to minimize any potential damage.
Yeah, hi. Probably a question for a couple on the panel. Richard Fechner from GHD. At the Southeast Asian Future Energy Conference in June, we tabled some research we'd done on the viability of Southeast Asian ports to be used for green fuels, thinking about the safety of the land, the access to fuels and those sorts of things. The other challenge is the nature of the shipping vessels and which ones will be in the fleet replacement or re-engineering piece to progress first. And that will also have an effect on which ports will move first because of the nature of the port itself, clearances and such like. So I'm just keen to get the thoughts of the panel on how both those challenges, not only is the fuel availability, the ideal ports long term and how the market forces the fleet changeover will drive either efficient use of revenue of cost to go for long term, or do you think there'll be a whole lot of short term investments that won't be long term viable and sort of decrease the efficiency of the transition, if that makes sense?
Look, I'll have a crack. I think going to sort of Anna's question earlier, I think there is, notwithstanding sort of remarks on sort of the likely sort of emergence of ammonia, I think it is quite clear there are still, various pathways out there. And I think particularly when you look at different sort of scale of shipping, so certainly, within ports and sort of smaller journeys, like definitely a role for electric vehicles, right? And I think that's, vessels rather. So I think that just sort of context dependent, but certainly for larger shipping, ammonia is looking very prospective. I think from our perspective, and sort of recognising that, I think, again, context, like what's our role? We're not a major manufacturer of ships, right? But we are a prospective manufacturer of fuel. So I think for us, it's basically being very plugged into the global environment, seeing where shipping companies are going, but also trying to make sure that we're providing that confidence that, that we are stepping up to provide that fuel and that it will be available. I think, that probably feeds into some of our focus on ammonia rather than sort of sub-products further down the value chain, is because ammonia, hydrogen will be useful for ammonia or methanol or, or other fuels. So I think there's a sense of that sort of, and it also drives the cost predominantly of all those fuels. So I think that's the strategy from us, but it's a good question, yeah.
I would just, we've done a lot of work on the system transformation and what the transition could look like for the global sector. And I think, we've got a goal of around 5 to 10% zero emission fuel uptake by 2030. That's set out in the IMO greenhouse gas strategy. And so when we say, well, where does that 5 to 10%, what is it, where is it, who is it that's going to be moving first? then you could start to say that that's probably going to be made up of those ships that are on more liner routes where they know where they're going to be bunkering, rather than the more international tramping trade where they don't know where they're going to be and they can't plan that long term. So we'd say that, when you're looking at who's that first mover to do that 5 to 10%, it's probably going to be, like you said, things like, liner container shipping, maybe some of the liner routes, like the iron ore trade routes. Again, maybe some of the cruise sector have kind of defined itinerary. But then, like you say, when we look at it from a technology pathway perspective, large ships, deep sea, would need to replace with some kind of liquid fuel, which we're saying green ammonia looks the most economically and technically feasible, but a lot of the short sea shipping, so if you're looking in Southeast Asia, some of the smaller feeder vessels might be able to use battery technology in some of the shorter routes, and we see a lot of that. So I think you've got to take into consideration routes, ship size, these kinds of things. So although it's not going to be, we're a one fuel sector at the moment, we're not going to all transition to all use the same energy source in time. So, but the majority will be using green ammonia, but then there will still be some niche parts of shipping that would use other technologies. So, and then I think now, because we've got getting more prescriptive and the regulation is coming in, then that regulatory environment will be moving the mass market. So we've got this first mover market at the moment that is moving, and then as the regulation enters into force, then that's going to move the mass market.
That's also one of the most, and then Philip, one of the most exciting parts about what's happening right now in this space is that actually we are moving into that regulation, and we've got obviously the key debate again in April around the greenhouse gas reduction strategy, those very specific midterm measures. But I would say, at least just from an industry perspective, all of our future planning, we've made very, very ambitious climate commitments, including a real zero by 2030 and a full zero, right, for our Scope 3 emissions also by 2040. There's a lot of deep collaboration that's happening as this, kind of as illustrated by the Fortescue Green Pioneer and the NBA. So a lot of deep coordination that's happening between ports, and I think in a lot of the operators, especially during those first investments. Philip.
So this may be embarrassing for me because I'm an engineer. I should know the answer to this question. But I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. We're currently one of the world's largest exporters of ammonia and methanol. And the question is whether it's Trinidad and Tobago or other parts of the world who already have ports that are well seasoned in handling gray ammonia and gray methanol, is that an inherent starting point to focus energies on in the transition of having ammonia and methanol as a shipping fuel? Or is it a completely different skill set? And yeah, I'm just curious. Yeah.
And I think Ryan might be best placed to answer that, but I would imagine that having so many trained individuals and professionals that know how to handle ammonia has to be a huge competitive advantage, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I do think that ports that have experience in handling some of these fuels, some of these chemicals before they were fuels, would definitely have a huge advantage. Even in Singapore, we do have quite a big chemicals industry, and we have actually been handling ammonia and methanol in Singapore as well. But what we have also come to realize is that handling it as a cargo, so just as with the tanker or the carrier going to the terminal and doing loading or unloading operations is possibly different from bunkering a vessel that is carrying iron ore or a vessel that is carrying containers. And in Singapore, much of our bunkering is done at the container port with simultaneously with container operations, or at the anchorages where it's ship to ship. Those circumstances and those kind of operations present, I wouldn't say slightly, I'd say quite significant, significantly different risks. So even with ports that have some of these experience, I think that's a good starting point, but I think there's still quite a lot in terms of making sure that the standards and the practices and the guidelines are at a level that would be suitable for bunkering. I think the other thing to say is also the scale of it. I think someone mentioned earlier about how much fuel we'll need in the future.
Yeah, 240 million tons is what they estimate of ammonia.
Yeah. So that's a lot more ammonia than any port handles today, I think. And so that's also another thing to be aware of.
Can I also say that like you said, it is a good starting point, but like you said, carrying ammonia as a cargo is very different to using ammonia in an engine room in an enclosed space. And I think that's the difference. So although we've got crews on board ships who are used to handling it as a cargo, they're not used to using it in an enclosed space in the engine room. So I think, and I know with the Green Pioneer, using ammonia...
It's a huge challenge.
A huge learning curve of using ammonia in an enclosed space, and how different the detection systems need to be in the engine room, how different the PPE needs to be that you wear in the engine room, so you've got your own personal detectors as well as detection and the evacuation routes. And so I think it's things like that. Yes, we're used to handling ammonia as a cargo, but more in the open air. So if there is a leak, there's going to be a plume in the atmosphere and it would dissipate, but in an enclosed space, very different challenges that we have to address and work those out.
We have a final question.
Thank you. I can say the Singapore has a very visionable target about the ammonia green corridor, but still we need very tremendous of ammonia to get on green corridor actually working, and I guess Singapore should invest whole scale of the whole value chains with a lot of capacity. And then the question is, do we have some kind of expectation or at least the guesstimation for about the Romson number? For example, in 5 years and 10 years, how much the operational cost would increase compared in the current stage of fossil fuel? If we have some,
I think there's a lot of work that's been done on estimating what we think the incremental cost could look like. But probably a really important thing to keep in mind is that part of the IMO regulations that are under discussion right now are also, they're looking at effectively a carbon pricing mechanism, or a pricing mechanism on emissions that would have an in-sector revenue distribution, which would also help facilitate covering a little bit of the green premium. It also helps in building up the capacity around ports to start future-proofing. It would also have revenues available for other areas within the shipping sector, maybe even just a ship conversion, for example. So there certainly are a lot of incremental costs, and there's a lot of great reports, I think, that maybe, I don't know if Oceans of Opportunity, the RMI report also looks at those additional.
It does, but I would also point to our close partner at the Maersk Mckinney Miller Center. They've done lots of work of cost benchmarking, and they're a great resource as well. But I think, again, in reality, some of that cost premium is already being bridged. If you look at specific market connections, like the US with the support from the Inflation Reduction Act, and the European Union including shipping into their trading scheme, those two policy schemes actually bridge the cost premium. So there are some markets where there is no cost premium, and then of course others where it's larger, and in some cases it's underpinned by fossil fuel subsidies or other mechanisms. So it is kind of a how long is a rope question of what's the cost premium, right? But I think what the IMO is doing, which is commendable, is to create really try to create a equal market globally, which I think the whole industry is looking forward to sort of step up to the supply challenge.
Excellent. Well, I think we're coming to the end of our panel. Thank you so much for being here. For us at Fortescue, it's just been a real joy to be part of this public-private partnership, if you will, with the MPA. I think it's a real example of how this kind of great Australian-Singaporean collaboration can really start paving the way and hopefully building confidence for other players in the future to be able to quickly follow. So thank you again and have a lovely Saturday.